Hi, I'm Heidi Larson. I lead a research group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine on public trust in vaccines. We call the group the Vaccine Confidence Project. Today I'm going to talk about what are some of the drivers of what makes people accept and trust vaccines, and what are some of the things that affect their distrust, and what can we do about it. The Vaccine Confidence Project, we have a research group of about 12 people. We're looking at vaccines around the world. What are the different reasons that people accept them or don't accept them? And sometimes it's social or cultural, religious. Sometimes it's concerns about safety. And sometimes it's just fear of needles. But we look at that and it's very different in different countries. The history of questioning and public trust around vaccines goes back to the very first vaccines, Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine. Even then, there were questions from the public about why they needed this invasive injection in their arm. In that case, it saved their lives from a very fatal illness, smallpox. But they had illustrations of vaccine monsters and all kinds of anti-compulsory vaccines groups. They were against compulsory vaccination. So this questioning and quasi-resistance dates back 200 years ago. And some of the reasons were about safety, some were religious, some were that they weren't sure if they were effective, and sometimes they didn't really understand the principles. But a lot of these issues are still resonant to over 200 years later. What's happened now? Well, we have quite a changed global environment aside from those human instincts of fear about putting a foreign object in your arm, which is one of the early things. We're in a very strong environment of distrust right now at many levels of society, in government, in religious institutions, and it's also affecting the medical and health system and medical products such as vaccines and some drugs. We have a stronger democratic right to know and right to information environment. We have an incredible global social media network that is certainly facilitating the quick sharing of not just positive information, but also anxieties and concerns. And all of these contribute to this distrust around vaccines. It's not everybody. 80% and more of people around the world take their basic, certainly the childhood vaccines. The anxieties tend to be a bit more around the newer vaccines, and once people get used to them and familiar, they become more routine. But even Margaret Chan, the WHO Director General, said to her executive board that the days when health officials could issue advice based on the very best medical and scientific advice and expect populations to comply is over. So when the Director General of the World Health Organization acknowledges that it's a changed environment and we have to do more and different strategies to encourage publics to accept vaccines, it's pretty important. The media can save lives, but it can also create anxieties. It's also full of contradictions. So one of the things that needs to happen more is engagement with the media, and not at the time of a crisis, but to build those relationships with health reporters, with media, ongoing relationships, so you don't wait for a crisis to call a local news reporter, whether it's online or in the press. This is not also a uniquely European or North American issue. It's absolutely global, but the nature of the reasons for vaccine refusal varies. Sometimes the issues are around motives. Are you experimenting on me with a new vaccine? And all kinds of anxieties when there's a lack, especially when people feel they don't have enough information. And It's also related to other things outside of vaccination. It can be related to a previous bad experience in a health center or with a certain health provider. So every time there's an interaction between a doctor or a pediatrician, a nurse, and a patient, parent or child, that's remembered. So that's important to keep that relationship positive. People's emotions and perceptions also change. It's like political opinion polling. It goes up and down. There's some consistency, but things can be volatile. You can have people accepting vaccines for a decade and then some event happens that makes them concerned. So we have to be constantly alert and listening to our publics and monitoring their views and listening to their perceptions. These issues of, as I said, trust and distrust are not always just about the product, the vaccine. It can be about the health system, and it can be about the broader relationship with government, because governments regulate, provide, and sometimes require vaccinations. So those are all important relationships of trust. As I mentioned earlier, the role of social media is very important. It can be a huge opportunity for getting out the good news about new vaccines or communicating vaccine schedules, keeping people, and especially young mothers, up to date with children's vaccination programs. But it can also be risky if someone has a concern or a fear or misinformation and spreads it widely. So it's a bit of an opportunity, and it's also a bit of a risk to have such ubiquitous social media, not just locally, but globally. The other side of the social media is that it offers researchers an opportunity to hear spontaneous discussions and conversations and hear what the public is thinking. The problem is it's not the whole public. It's just the people who have an opinion, and usually a strong opinion, on these issues. But it does help provide information about some of the perceptions and concerns, and particularly when it comes to safety. It's always very important to listen to people, because maybe there is a safety issue that needs to be investigated, and maybe there's something with the delivery strategy, that the immunizations are given on a Tuesday, which is a bad day for some people because of a school schedule, and it should maybe be on a Thursday. And we can learn cues to improve our systems by listening to our publics and patients. What are some of the things that drive these different perceptions? As I've mentioned earlier, sometimes it's safety, sometimes it's actually overconfidence. Parents and the public who think that natural immunity is enough. They don't need a vaccine. And the issue with vaccines is that we've done such a good job historically, since vaccines were introduced more widely in the early 80s, but have been around for 200 years for some, is that people don't see the diseases anymore. But the vaccines are keeping them controlled. Once the vaccination stops, or even portions of the population, herd immunity is broken, and we'll be back to where we started. Well, what do we do to get a better handle on the issue of distrust and trust, and how do we sustain the cooperation and the confidence of the public? And one of the things we're doing in our research group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is to be measuring and monitoring. We're doing a mix of media monitoring, surveys, reading and interviewing people, more qualitative research to understand better what's been going on. And we've published various articles on issues in vaccine hesitancy, public trust, and addressing what we call the vaccine confidence gap. A lot of this is available. I've put a few of the publications here on the screen, but you can easily access them online. The amount of attention to this issue of vaccine hesitancy has increased considerably in the last 5 years. As I said, the overall questions and concerns about vaccines, in a small way, have been around for a couple hundred years. But there's been a significant increase in the presence of this questioning and the amount of research starting to look at it and understand it. Part of that is because we have a lot more vaccines. When I was a child, I had 6 vaccinations, and that's all that were available. But now there's many more vaccines and combinations of vaccines. So the questioning is reasonably so related to a number of the newer vaccines. And I think that it's important that particularly young mothers with a first child do ask some questions. It's responsible. But the important thing is that they have access to the correct information, and there's a lot of incorrect information that's easily accessible these days. In our, we have done a systematic review of the existing literature for WHO. There's been an advisory group over the last few years to SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts. We had a working group specifically on this issue of vaccine hesitancy. We found that the research on this topic has doubled in the last 5 years. Most of it is in Europe and the Americas, so we really need a lot more in the rest of the world because there are these transnational influences and we need to understand them better. As I mentioned earlier, the reasons for people's acceptance or refusals of vaccine vary considerably. And in our working group for the SAGE Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on immunization, we came up with 3 major domains of influence on vaccine acceptance. One are kind of contextual influences, politics, religion, other external events that happen. And then there's individual and personal experiences, relationships with friends, professionals, others where you get peer influences. And then there's just the vaccine itself, maybe some safety issues or maybe some issues with the schedule. There's been interesting research around the world, but in Eastern Europe, for instance, there was some research on who's against or questioning vaccines. And we saw across these different countries that the reasons varied considerably, as you can see here. And the other thing is, where do people get their, where do they get their information? They get it from a lot of different sources, and the impact of that is quite varied. So we really need to understand where people get their information in order to get them the right information. We've also done particular research on vaccines among pregnant moms, which is one particular risk group, both for the baby and the mother. And we've looked at the different reasons. And with pregnant mothers, the anxieties about vaccines for those who have anxieties is often about safety. So that needs to be made really clear and understood by the moms why it's important, both to protect infants and themselves. Despite all this questioning environment, which again is a small portion but tends to have a louder voice, still, despite all the misinformation and questioning out there, the source of information most trusted is GPs and health providers. So we need to make sure that that is sustained, that is still important, and that trust relationship is not lost. It's still the most important to patients, to the public. And there's been more and more research done on what's the best way to interact with patients, particularly parents of young children. And there was some very interesting research done at the University of Washington, led by Doug Opel, that was comparing what they called a presumptive or participatory discussion. Do you start a conversation with your patient saying, what do you think about vaccines? Or do you say, today's the day we're going to get measles vaccine and your DTP vaccine. Being open to any feedback, but starting with a positive, specific, this is what we're going to get today. What they found out that it was actually better to start with a positive, confirmed approach, being open again to discussion, but not starting with too open, because then it gives the sense that the doctor himself might not be confident. So to sum up here, what can we do about these issues of vaccine hesitancy? Well, understand what's driving them. That's the most important part. You can't fix something that you don't really understand. Recognize that most people do vaccinate, and keep the support going for those who are positive. It has influence on their peers, their neighbors, and their family. What I mentioned before with the interaction with parents, start with the positive, with the information, but be open to discussion and dialogue, because that's an important, patients and parents need to know that they can ask questions, and they won't have the door closed on that. And never underestimate the importance of listening. It has again and again come up in a lot of our research that the thing that can turn parents' minds against a vaccine is when they feel like their questions are not being answered, and that increases their distrust rather than